There were many drivers of Donald Trump's victory in the U.S. election, but immigration was without a doubt one of the key issues throughout his campaign and a cornerstone of his draw for many voters. Trump's appeal to fear is well known, whether he's blaming Haitians for eating pets in Ohio.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Or his long-standing refrain about Mexican criminals and rapists.
I took a lot of heat for saying it, but I was right. And now everybody is admitting that I was right. You know, that Trump was...
Or promising to deport millions of undocumented immigrants starting on day one of his new administration.
The invasion ends and the deportations begin. We get them out.
But these ideas caught on with many voters, including Latinos. According to the Washington Post, the 10 Texas counties with the largest Latino population moved an average of 28% towards Republicans. The question now is, what will Trump actually do? Will he seek to round up and kick 10 million people out of the country on January 21st? Will he alienate certain business leaders who rely on cheap immigrant labor? Will he reconfigure U.S. policy to focus on admitting skilled workers and reducing the number of unskilled migrants? Welcome to Counterpoint. Each week, we'll look at one pressing question facing world leaders from two opposing points of view. I'm Sasha Polakow-Suransky, a deputy editor at Foreign Policy and your host and moderator for the show. Today, we're going to debate the question, how should Trump tackle the U.S. immigration crisis? I'm really happy to welcome today's guests, not only because they're my friends who I've known for more than 20 years, but because we can count on them to have a serious civil discussion about a controversial issue, without descending into shouting and name-calling as debates on this topic often do. So, having set that high bar, I'd like to introduce Leah Boustan, a professor of economics at Princeton University and co-author of Streets of Gold, America's Untold Story of Immigrant Success. Welcome, Leah.
Great to be here, Sasha.
And Reihan Salam, president of the Manhattan Institute and author of Melting Pot or Civil War, A Son of Immigrants Makes the Case Against Open Borders. Welcome, Reihan.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you very much.
Counterpoint is a foreign policy podcast in partnership with the Doha Forum. Let's get started. Reihan, what can we expect from Trump on immigration in his first 100 days?
That's hard to say. The president-elect has taken a wide range of positions on the immigration question, particularly as it pertains to legal immigration. He is now at the helm of a pretty broad and expansive coalition that has a range of different impulses on those issues. So what we can safely say is that the president-elect and his team have a thesis about why we've seen a border crisis. Their thesis is that they had put in place, through a trial and error process, a range of different policies, chiefly through their executive authority, that had tamped down the problem. They sent clear, unmistakable messages to potential migrants. And essentially, over the first 100 days of the Biden administration, those policies were dismantled and reversed. The messaging became very mixed at best, and that this precipitated the crisis, that there was this kind of sharp ideological reaction against policies that, in their view, worked pretty effectively to stem the tide of irregular migration. And so they're going to look to basically unpick the lock, to undo those changes, not just in policy, but also in messaging.
Getting into some of the specifics, I mean, the thing that a lot of people talk about and certain people who do not support Trump worry about is this idea of mass deportation. Do you see that as one of the key components of this policy and this thesis, as you put it? And is that something we're likely to see in the coming months?
Well, here's the beauty of the term mass deportation. It can mean absolutely anything. If you look at the first Trump presidency, he deported fewer migrants than the Obama administration did. And if you're looking at folks, on his team, how they're thinking about this, how they're approaching it, there's an aspirational goal that people who are unauthorized should not be allowed to remain in the country. But the clashing impulses within the Trump team are that there are a lot of people who are veterans of that first administration who are saying that we need to do things that are administrable, that are visible, but that also elicit more support than backlash. And those people are saying focus on criminal aliens and recent violators. Why? Because that is a situation where you'll have more of the public at your side. Now, do you end there? Not necessarily. The whole idea is that you build credibility and public support rather than elicit an immediate backlash. And then there are others who are saying you need some kind of shock and awe approach. That was the Steve Bannon approach in the first administration. And I think that there is a clash here, but my sense is that the people who want to approach this in a more deliberate way are, at least for now, winning out.
Leah, do you take any solace from the idea that there are moderates within Trump's team, or how do you see this, and what do you fear most about Trump's potential immigration policies?
Well, first of all, I should say that I'm an economic historian, so most of my work has focused on immigration over the course of U.S. history. So I'm not a modern policy person. But when I look back in U.S. history, there's been many, many calls for deportation, mass deportation, where there's actual interior enforcement. And there's only really been two major episodes of this taking place. One is during the Great Depression, when around 500,000 Mexican immigrants were encouraged to leave or forcibly removed, depending on which historian you believe. And one is in the mid-1950s, under the Eisenhower administration during a program called Operation Wetback, which was, again, targeted against Mexican immigrants, again, around 1 million people. And why do we not see more action when we hear this kind of rhetoric quite often? I think the reason why is that it's just incredibly expensive to actually follow up on the most maximal version of mass deportation. But I think what will ultimately happen is sort of a rebranding of the types of programs that we've already had in place off and on. So, like Reihan mentioned, under the Obama presidency, some people called Obama the deporter-in-chief. He deported, depending on how you actually count it, somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million migrants a year. And the question depends on how much you count the voluntary but strongly enforced departures. And in the middle of the Obama administration, he passed a program called priority enforcement, saying, let's go after criminals first. And my guess is that type of a program will be revived, perhaps revived on steroids, and it will be branded as the mass deportation that we heard about during the campaign.
So, Leah, since you're an economist and you mentioned cost earlier, I'm curious whether there's any serious economic rationale, in your view, for these policies. I mean, what is the economic impact of what you've just described, and what would the economic impact of a more extreme, larger scale deportation be?
I think the two justifications that are often given for this kind of a program are crime or economic competition. Politicians have often said immigrants contribute to crime and are more likely to commit crime. But when you look at the overall data on immigrants as a whole are actually substantially less likely to commit crimes than the U.S.-born. Targeting all immigrants for deportation, that doesn't seem to have an economic benefit. On the economic competition side, broadly speaking, there's a few major sectors in the economy, construction and agriculture, that are very heavily dependent on immigrant labor, both legal and illegal. And with a mass deportation, like if you could snap your fingers and overnight deport the 13 or 12 or 11 million undocumented in the country, there's a number of sectors that would go through major shakeout. And my guess is that a number of projects would just shut down. So if you were thinking of renovating your kitchen and you imagined it was at a certain cost and then suddenly the cost was a lot higher, probably just wouldn't go ahead with that project. If you were thinking of planting a field with, microgreens that require people to pick the lettuce by hand, and now the cost was a lot higher, you probably would just leave the land fallow.
Reihan, I'm curious what your response to that would be in terms of economic impact on those sorts of sectors, agriculture and construction.
I think there's no question that it would have an effect. The question is, would the effect be salutary? What is the timeline we're talking about? And what are our values and priorities? This is something that people, I think, often miss. There's a lump of labor fallacy. the idea that, when you think about competition, when you think about how labor markets work, it's just the raw number of workers. But another way to think about a labor market is that, particularly in a dynamic market economy, is that it's more like an accordion. You will accommodate workers. If half of the population of Bangladesh, my parents' native country, moved to the United States next week, there would be work for those folks to do. What would also happen, however, is that business models would change, the mix of capital and labor would change. And the question then is, how does the larger economy, how does our regulatory mix accommodate this? When you bring in a lot more people, you need to build a lot more housing. You need to address their needs, because these are people who are not just workers. They're also people who need medical care. They need, their children need to be educated and what have you. This is what I've always said to my friends who are big advocates of immigration. I think of myself as someone who loves and embraces the idea of building immigrant-rich neighborhoods. I think immigration can be a huge boon. What people don't understand, though, is that these adjustments in how society accommodates these inflows can matter a huge, huge amount. So the economic reasoning here, it's so frustrating to me, because you hear these people saying that, yes, it will increase GDP. Well, I'm sure that's true. But, where will the benefits flow? And it's not just a matter of competition. It's also a matter of legitimacy. Because in democratic societies, you are going to get a backlash when you don't have those adjustments in how society accommodates this inflow. And those things are subject to democratic political contestation. So people who want high inflows should think really long and hard, not just about the kind of, straightforward economics 101 arguments, which I think are totally sound and reasonable, but rather about whether or not you've built a sustainable approach to how this is going to work and the kind of impacts this is happening locally.
Leah, it's interesting that Reihan mentions democratic legitimacy, because it seems like what's just happened is that voters have given a very clear signal that they don't believe that the policies of the Biden administration had very much legitimacy, or at least they didn't really align with the majority of U.S. voters who voiced their views on immigration in this election. What do you make of that?
One of the reasons why there's concern about immigration is precisely because of what is this going to do for the spending mix in my city or town. Are we going to have to spend more on schools? Are we going to have to pay for, ESL, English as a second language classes? Will the schools become crowded and the class sizes will go up if we're not building new schools in response? And then on the housing market side, if we're not building new housing, will housing prices go up and it will become harder for me to rent or to afford my first home? So getting into the democratic legitimacy that you asked about, Sasha, people were raising questions about housing prices. And those are legitimate questions, but oftentimes they would be dismissed or brushed under the rug, because the question is, well, why are you raising this issue? Are you raising this issue because you're secretly xenophobic? Well, these are legitimate questions to ask. And if they're not part of the debate, then it's very hard for the voters to get heard, except at the ballot box.
So you're a professor. Let's get a bit academic here. Your first book was about Black migrants from the South who went to northern U.S. cities and how competition between them and other Black workers created winners and losers. Is there a lesson from that period for what we're seeing now between recent immigrants and U.S. citizens on the lower end of the labor market?
Or previous immigrants, by the way.
Right. I mean, what I found in my earlier work on the Great Migration is that white workers were substantially insulated from the arrival of Black workers in their cities. Black workers were limited to particular sets of occupations or particular firms that would be willing to hire them, and ultimately then did not pose very much competition for white workers that otherwise might look similar on paper. So who was actually experiencing wage loss when Black migrants moved up to cities? It was actually the existing Black community. And it was those earlier arrivals that really did face wage pressure. Other economists who've looked at similar questions in the modern data have found really a very similar result today, that when migrants arrive today, they're more likely to lead to wage pressure for existing migrant communities. And that may actually be one of the keys to understanding, why did migrant communities swing to Trump? Why did the counties that you mentioned, Sasha, that are on the Texas-Mexico border swing to Trump, not only in this election, but also in the last one?
So, Reihan, this strikes me as very similar to a theme in your book, Melting Pot or Civil War. One of the ideas I remember is that the daughter of a Latina maid who wants a better career for herself, or a young Black man competing with undocumented immigrants for jobs, might eventually drift away from Democrats because of things like wage pressure from new arrivals. Do you think that's happening now?
I certainly do think that's happening. When you think about restrictionist movements in American life, when they've succeeded, they've typically succeeded by winning over some non-trivial share of those who are themselves of recent immigrant origin. Immigrants themselves were naturalized, or people who are second-generation Americans. There's a great term that I associate with the economist David Card, compositional amenities. His point, and he is one of the premier labor economists who is making this case that the impacts of immigration on natives, are pretty muted. They're pretty modest, typically, and maybe even modestly positive more often than not. But that doesn't speak to the compositional amenities. That is the composition of a population. When it comes to social trust or when it comes to any number of things, people value it to some degree. And when you're thinking about people who are themselves of recent immigrant origin, it doesn't change the fact that they might value a given composition of their neighborhood, of their community. And I think that that is something that's really, really important. When you combine that with the fact that people, in my view, really oversimplify the economic dimension of this kind of marked population change, I think you together get a picture that is a lot more complex than a lot of folks of a kind of cosmopolitan orientation would have you believe. Think about all of those cute, charming, gentrified urban neighborhoods that we all know and love, where you have these signs talking about how we welcome refugees and all of this stuff. And those being the very same neighborhoods that are way out of reach for lower middle class, working class people because they're so obscenely expensive. That contradiction is something that I think for a lot of self-flagellating liberals is a really tough one. And I think people are thinking about it. But actually, the politics of getting there right and changing that are really hard, especially when there will be some newcomers who are going to pay much, much more in taxes than they receive in benefits. And there are going to be others who are going to be very much in need, where their skills are not necessarily a fit for an urban, advanced economy that values some skills and devalues others. This is the thing that's really, really hard. There are a lot of people that I love and respect who kind of think it all worked out 100 years ago, it's going to work out today. And, this is a little cheesy, but before you had an ocean to cross, you needed to save a ton of money to make your way across. And now, as those barriers become lower and lower, that does mean that, the selection effect when it comes to just those natural barriers to immigration, to migration, as those barriers change, it's not ridiculous to suggest that policy needs to step in if what you're thinking is that you do think that some selection is good and reasonable and helpful when it comes to facilitating labor market entry, assimilation, etc. That's the thing that I think of myself as crusading against. The idea that when everything else changes, still the answer is always going to be laissez-faire.
So, Leah, I want to go back to this issue of skilled versus unskilled immigration, because this is something that the two of you have disagreed on in the past. In your view, has immigration, even unskilled immigration, benefited the U.S. economy over time?
Well, in some recent work that then became the core of Streets of Gold, Ron Abramovsky and I, Ron's my longtime collaborator, looked at the trajectory of immigrant families today and in the past. We looked at the children of immigrants to see, are they moving up, even if they're being raised in poor households? What shocked me was that the children are moving up into the middle class at the same pace as they were 100 years ago. Now, Reihan has pointed out, well, we only have a limited number of immigration slots. And so if, let's say, we have 1 million slots for entrance in any given year, it's true that the children of low-paid, low-skilled immigrants eventually move into the middle class, but the children of high-skilled, high-paid immigrants are already there. And in fact, they're not just middle class, they're upper middle class. So if we have limited slots, maybe we need to be judicious about using those slots. And I would agree with that in principle, but I also think that we have labor needs that may not be filled without unskilled immigration. And we've talked already about agriculture. And so if we have labor needs that really require a person that can't be mechanized, that could be in agriculture, that could be in elder care, that could be in childcare, could be in restaurant work. And we think that the pay that is profitable in those industries is low enough that it's unlikely that U.S.-born workers are going to fill those needs, then I think, we should have a smart policy for low-skilled immigration. The point is, it's not that low-skilled work has to necessarily be illegal or undocumented work. It can be managed through the legal immigration system. And if we have those labor needs, then I think that we can use the immigration system without fear for the future.
You're listening to Counterpoint. I'm Sasha Polakow-Suransky. We'll be right back. So, Reihan, I'm curious what you make of Leah's argument that there's some jobs that U.S.-born workers would not fill and that we need this immigration, and also the idea that even if it takes a generation, low-skilled immigration ends up being a force for good.
I would frame it differently. So I think that, look, Qatar and Singapore, these are societies that admit enormous numbers of guest workers. They regulate migration very stringently, and I would argue very successfully. They leverage mass low-skill migration in a way that's greatly enriched their native-born population. The thing is that those are countries that are willing to really get tough. They're willing to really do things that they feel they need to do to ensure that they're maximizing those economic benefits. When you look at the United States, we do not have the kind of administrative capacity, but also I would argue we don't have the kind of will to engage in the stringent immigration enforcement that Singapore engages in. When you look at past patterns of immigration enforcement in Canada, Australia, other market democracies that have admitted high inflows, they just do different things to ensure that the balance of benefits and burdens is favorable to the native population. So do I believe that you could benefit? I mean, I've tried to say this from the very beginning. Absolutely you can. But in the absence of large low-skill inflows, guess what? What you see is more capital investment in agriculture. You see more mechanization in agriculture. You see more imports. If there is a tension and contradiction in, call it the Trumpist approach to global economic integration, it's that normally when you say, hey, I'm going to be super selective with immigrants, what they also do is say, we're going to embrace trade. And we're going to say that labor-intensive services, we're comfortable with those happening overseas.
Well, first of all, I agree completely that if we can't produce products that require low-skilled labor here in the U.S., the natural next step would be to turn to trade. And so if we can't pick lettuce here in the US, the lettuce will be planted in Mexico and we will simply import the lettuce. But I worry about combining a policy of mass deportation or even just major restriction on immigration with a policy of across-the-board tariffs. I don't see how the two of those together will allow for the standard of living and the price level that Americans have come to expect. So perhaps what we'll see going forward is that one or the other one of those commitments that were part of the campaign will be softened.
So let me follow up on that a bit, because I think we're getting into the nitty-gritty of the economic policy here. But I'm curious whether this unskilled versus skilled immigration debate has a moral dimension for you, Leah. Do you look at this in the sense that the U.S. has welcomed large numbers of people in the past, assimilated them, and then a few generations hence, those people have become beneficial to the economy? Is there a moral dimension to that?
Well, I think that there are economists, particularly development economists like Lant Pritchett, who think about immigration from the perspective of the migrant themselves. And they make arguments like, immigration is the best development policy we could imagine, far better than giving foreign aid. If we can pluck a person out of a poor country and magically transport that person to the US, that person's life will be so much better as measured by the income they're able to earn. And that is a way of thinking that naturally leads people towards policies like open borders. That's not something that Ron and I were thinking about very much in our work. So I can see the argument from the moral perspective of immigration is the best way to help individuals. But I think our framework was much more along the lines of our society and our nation. But Sasha, you were asking about, U.S. history. We've been successful in integrating immigrants in the past, and is it something that's part of our heritage? That is something that has been very compelling to us, this idea of the nation of immigrants. And we were concerned that perhaps this was a vestige of our past, but was not going to be something we could continue with going forward. Maybe it was the case that 100 years ago, immigrants were really coming from similar societies, from European countries. And today we have immigrants from all over the world, and somehow the patterns would look different. And what we found, which surprised us but heartened us, was that that's not the case, that immigrants' success today looks pretty similar to immigrant success in the past, even though the sending countries have changed. We should be very hesitant to let that tradition go. It's something that is unique about the U.S., or at least about the immigrant receiving New World countries, and we don't want to go in the direction of Europe.
So, Reihan, I'm curious about your response to this, because you obviously have some firsthand experience with this question. You grew up in a part of Brooklyn full of immigrant families like yours, some of them quite skilled immigrant families, some of them not so skilled. And I'm just curious, even if the kids of the guy who owns the bodega down the street don't go to an Ivy League institution, maybe his grandkids will. And do you think that is an argument for letting a new generation of unskilled workers in these days?
I have to say, I think about these issues differently. The reason I am a conservative is that I consider myself a realist. And when I think about the moral calculation at stake, I don't typically think about it when it comes to sympathetic claimants or the individual case, however compelling the individual case might be. I think more in terms of the broader framework, public legitimacy, and whether or not you're going to elicit a ferocious backlash that is going to basically damage or undermine your ultimate ambition. From my perspective, I believe that immigration has been an enormous boon in American history, and it can continue to be an enormous boon. I also recognize that there have been moments when things have gone awry, and I do think that there have been these reactions. In some cases, they've been overreactions. There have been overcorrections. And I think that in this moment right now, what I really think I'm trying to do when it comes to this embrace of a more selective, call it more moderate immigration policy, that, will mean that there's some incredibly bright, ambitious strivers who come from modest means who would not, in my world, be able to make it to the United States and climb the ladder and be incorporated into our society and enrich it in all sorts of ways. The reason I say no to that is that my eye is on the prize of long-term having a sustainable level of inflows that we can accommodate comfortably, where we can actually build a society where you don't have these kind of violent, sharp backlashes back and forth. I want a policy that's sustainable. You can't just think about the sympathetic claimants. You have to think about the long term. You have to think about where the country is going to be 10, 20, 30 years from now. And that is why I come down where I come down. Of course, I know people, of course, and also just, when it comes to my own family, my own parents, they're people who, yes, they were skilled, but hey, depending how stringent the point system is, who knows? I mean, there's absolutely a world in which I would not be here today. But, as someone who's thinking about policy, thinking about the long term, thinking about crafting the right kind of settlement that's going to be durable for my country, I just think that has to come above short-term sentiment.
So, Leah, you mentioned Europe. If we look at Europe now, all of these governments, Italy, the Netherlands, Austria, are the most recent examples, but the far right is doing very well. Parties with anti-immigration platforms are doing very well. And I'm curious what you think European countries that aren't already governed by the anti-immigrant right could be doing to address this issue.
Well, what we find that's different about Europe relative to the US is twofold. First of all, in many more of the European destinations, immigrants are very clustered at the bottom of the income distribution. And so for all of the concerns that Reihan has raised in the US about selective immigration and trying to pick immigrants who are really at the top, we have immigrants who are at all points of the distribution here. We have very poor, we have middle, and we have top. And in many European destinations, that's not true. So, of course, the children of immigrants who are raised in low-income households are not going to be doing as well as the children of the average local-born person in Europe. And I think that that's generating a lot of the concern. But another thing that we find is even if you adjust for household income and you say, let's compare a French-born family and a immigrant family in France, both raising their kids at like the 10th or 15th percentile of the income distribution, the sons of immigrants are still doing worse. And particularly doing worse in places in Europe that are hailed for being very high mobility for their local-born population. Places like the Netherlands, places like Austria. So I think there's probably two directions there. One is maybe the more liberal direction, like let's try to take a look at our own institutions and see if we can democratize them and provide access. And one, you may say is the more conservative direction of selective immigration policy. But I don't think we need to put these into boxes. I think we need to be very, clear-headed and look at the data and get a sense of where the challenges are coming from and then move forward from there.
So just briefly, I think one thing that's really important to understand is that selection can be a dynamic process. When people talk about high skill, low skill, they often behave as though these are fixed characteristics of a person. And my favorite example, and I'm drawing on work by another really passionate immigration advocate, Michael Clemens, look to Fiji. Fiji is a country that experienced this huge domestic political shock that made a lot of Fijians of Indian origin really anxious about their future. So what suddenly happened is that native Fijians and Indian Fijians, they used to have the same level of education attainment. And then after this domestic political shock, Fijians of Indian origin started basically getting way, way more post-secondary education. And they didn't just do it randomly. They were getting the skills that would allow them to get visas to move to Australia and New Zealand. They were looking for an exit strategy. So a lot of them did wind up moving, but a lot of them stayed. And they literally wound up building an IT offshoring industry in Fiji. If you saw market democracies around the world say, we're going to change our policies and we're going to say, hey, language skills matter. We want you to do X, Y, and Z. Guess what? In 2015, you had a huge shock of people moving from Syria and Iraq, but also from Bangladesh and Morocco and elsewhere into Europe. Why? Was it because Bangladesh suddenly became a poor country? Was it because, Morocco suddenly became violent? No, it's because they saw an opportunity. They saw those policies change in Europe. Something very similar has happened in the United States at our southern border. Those enterprising, ambitious people who are exquisitely sensitive to migration incentives, if you say, hey, rather than just showing up randomly and claiming asylum, if you do these things, you will move up the queue. If you have these skills, if you get these job offers, you will move up the queue. People are not fixed. They respond to incentives. The incentives we are sending out right now are broken and frankly quite dumb. And instead, if you set up incentives that say, these are things that will help you succeed in the United States, in the Netherlands, elsewhere, and we are encouraging you to do those things, build those skills, those things will benefit those potential migrants, whether they move or not, when it comes to flourishing in a modern, dynamic, urban market economy. This is what I find so crazy about this, because it's almost though, oh, you hate the people who work in the bodega and you love the people who are software programmers. My friend, they're the same people, potentially. Not in every instance, but they often are the same people. If the incentive is to get a crooked K-1 visa and find, an American who wants to marry you, versus the incentive is to, build up your skills over time and get a job offer, people are going to do what they need to do to get into a country that's going to allow them to do better. So let's set up those incentives in a smarter way, rather than in a way that reflects our own weird psychodrama and our weird self-flagellation. Let's do something that's going to help everyone.
So, Leah, in your view, what should the Democrats do now? Is it going to be another 4 years of the resistance, or do you think there's a serious opposition policy, something tough but fair, that Democrats could put forward that might actually appeal to some of Trump's supporters?
Well, I think that the Harris campaign proposed a set of policies that are sensible, but were too little too late, and the voters could see right through them. So they wondered, well, why did you propose these policies now that you're being challenged and you're in a dead heat leading up to the election, and not propose them 3 years ago when we would have believed that this was truly what you had in mind? Even if you're pro-immigration, you don't like the idea that the system is being exploited. You know, that if there's a legitimate reason for claiming asylum among some portion of this group, but there's a large portion that are simply the same people who would have come in by crossing the border and are now using the asylum system, that strikes people as unfair. And so I think the voters, even those who were very comfortable with immigration numbers and maybe even increases in immigration numbers, want the system to be orderly. And I heard this again and again when I went around and talked to small groups about Streets of Gold. Many small groups in New Jersey, some left-leaning, some right-leaning, essentially just groups of citizens. And this idea of orderly system and concerns about breakdown in order popped up again and again. So I think the Democrats heard the message, but they heard the message very late. And they also did not publicize what they were doing because they were worried that there was a portion of their base that wouldn't like it. And so I imagine that going forward, Democrats are going to be more vocal in their support for these types of policies, and maybe they'll be able to frame the policies as the humane and reasonable response to a Trump administration that they could frame as out of control.
Well, this debate has also been very humane and reasonable, and I'd like to thank my guests, Leah Boustan, a professor of economics at Princeton University and co-author of Streets of Gold, and Reihan Salam, president of the Manhattan Institute and author of Melting Pot or Civil War. Thanks to you both.
Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you.
Counterpoint is a production of Foreign Policy in partnership with the Doha Forum. Our production staff includes Karen Given and Dan Efron, with special thanks to Claudia Tatey. We'll be taking a few weeks off, but we'll be back in December with a live recording from the Doha Forum. If you're enjoying Counterpoint, please tell a friend. You can also leave a rating or review on your podcast app. It helps other listeners find our show. I'm Sasha Polakow-Suransky. Thanks for listening.